you ready to cough up $220,000 to pay your share? One of the reasons why a day of reckoning for the U.S. economy is inevitable is because we are in way too much debt. The $22 trillion debt that the federal government has accumulated gets most of the attention. But the truth is that we would still be $50 trillion in debt even if the national debt was eliminated somehow. Today, debt levels are exploding on every level of society. Corporate debt has more than doubled since the last financial crisis. U.S. consumers are more than $13 trillion in debt, and state and local governments are piling up debt as if tomorrow will never come. According to a Federal Reserve chart that you can find right here, the total amount of debt in the U.S. financial system has now reached an astounding $72 trillion. Now, my father was a math teacher for many years, so I like numbers. I divided $72 trillion by the current population of the United States. Now, Google says it's 327.2 million. I discovered that it breaks down to more than $220,000 for every man, woman, and child in the entire country. So, if you have a family of 4, your share of all this debt is $880,000. This debt bubble has been growing much, much faster than the overall economy for a very long time. When Ronald Reagan took office, the total amount of debt in our system was less than $5 trillion. And when George W. Bush took office, the total amount of debt in our system was just over $29 trillion. Just prior to the last financial crisis, we surpassed the $54 trillion mark, and so since that time, we have added nearly $18 trillion to our total. Let's talk about consumer debt first. Excluding mortgage debt, consumer debt exceeded $4 trillion for the first time, according to the Federal Reserve. Americans are diving deeper and deeper into the red. Relatively strong holiday spending, particularly in November, and increasing credit card debt added more than $41 billion in outstanding balances at the end of 2018. And that's according to LendingTree, a loan comparison website which analyzed the data from the Fed. We have never seen this level of consumer debt before in all of U.S. history. Just a few days ago, I wrote about how tens of millions of Americans are living on the edge financially, and this is yet more evidence to back up that claim. Right now, Americans owe more than $1 trillion on auto loans. We are clearly in the greatest auto loan debt bubble that we've ever seen. Americans also owe more than $1 trillion on their credit cards, and credit card delinquency rates are rising. In fact, in some ways, what we witnessed during the first quarter of 2019 was quite reminiscent of the peak of the last financial crisis. The student loan debt bubble has also surpassed $1 trillion. The average young adult with student loan debt has a negative net worth. Despite economic and stock market gains over the past 9 years, many young adults are still struggling to get ahead in their financial lives, and in some ways, things may have actually gotten worse. Americans aged 25 to 34 with college degrees and student debt have a median net wealth of negative $1,900, according to a report analyzing 2016 Federal Reserve data released Thursday by Young Invincibles, a young adult advocacy group. That's a drop of $9,000 from 2013, YI's analysis found. Meanwhile, corporate debt has doubled since the last financial crisis. Thousands of companies are so highly leveraged that even a slight economic downturn could completely wipe them out. State and local government debt levels were also at record highs, but nobody seems to care. And if we never have another recession, everything might work out okay. The biggest offender of all, of course, is the United States federal government. We have been adding about $1 trillion a year to the national debt since Barack Obama first entered the White House. And Goldman Sachs is projecting that number will surpass $2 trillion by 2028. The fiscal outlook for the United States is not good, according to Goldman Sachs. and could pose a threat to the country's economic security during the next recession. According to forecasts from the bank's chief economist, the federal deficit will increase from $825 billion, or 4.1% of gross domestic product, to $1.25 trillion, 5.5% of GDP, by 2021. And by 2028, the bank expects the number to balloon to $2.05 trillion, 7% of GDP. Our national debt has been growing at an exponential rate for decades, and because total disaster has not struck yet, many people seem to believe that we can keep on doing this. But the truth is that it simply is not possible. There is only so much debt that a society can take on before the entire system implodes. So, how close are we to that point? The following chart comes from Hugh Smith. It shows the exponential rise in overall debt levels that has taken us to reach $72 trillion in debt. Of course, all of this debt will never actually be paid off. The only thing left to do is to keep this debt bubble going for as long as possible, and the only way to do that is to keep it growing at a faster pace than the overall economy is growing. And our financial engineers have definitely been successful in extending this Ponzi scheme for a lot longer than many of us had anticipated, but they can't keep doing this indefinitely. Every financial bubble in history has eventually ended, and this one will too. I really like what Hugh Smith had to say to Greg Hunter just the other day. Journalist and book author Hugh Smith says the next market crash and recession will unfold like the bursting of the 2000 dot-com bubble. Smith explains, the bubble popped or deflated not for any crisis, but simply because there was too much debt, too much leverage, too much euphoria, and unrealistic valuations. I think we are seeing that now in stocks, housing, and a lot of other assets around the world. The valuations just exceed what makes financial sense. And remember, we are at the longest expansion in history. It's over 10 years, and the average expansion lasts 5, 6, or 7 years. So this expansion is pretty long in the tooth. You'll get a slowdown, and that is a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Once people stop buying houses, once people stop buying cars, then you're going to get people being laid off, less people being able to afford to eat out. Then you get a self-reinforcing recession. It's not a crisis, but like an erosion, because everybody is kind of tapped out. Recently, President Trump and his economic advisors have been talking up rate cuts and money printing to help the economy. Are they seeing a slowdown coming? Smith, who has written 12 financial-oriented books, says, I think they do, and I think that's the only reasonable explanation for why they're talking about rate cuts when the employment is strong and the economy is looking good by many factors. Why would they want cheaper money unless they see the slowdown in auto sales, and they see the slowdown in housing, and they see a slowdown with all the things where you have to borrow a lot of money to make it work? Can Team Trump keep the economy going until after the 2020 election? Smith says, I think you are pushing a little bit on a string to get a 10-year-long expansion to stretch out to 12 years. It's like you're pushing sand uphill at some point. Inflation is roaring in assets. Housing is unaffordable in many areas. The stock market is at nosebleed levels. So it's kind of hard to say we're going to get another 2 years of growth, but I don't think anybody can say it can't happen. What we can say is debt levels are rising at a much faster rate than earned income. That's where you're going to get a reset at some point. As costs go up and debt levels go up, then lowering interest rates gives you a little leeway, but only for a while. In the end, nobody can fix our system, because our debt-based financial system was fundamentally flawed when it was designed. This is something that I have repeatedly pointed out, but unfortunately most Americans still don't seem to understand this very basic concept. You see, if you have a financial system that's literally designed to endlessly create more debt, more money, and more inflation, then you are living in a bubble economy. And a bubble economy can seem fine as long as the bubble is inflating and economic activity seems to be humming along. But when things start to go bad, they can go really, really bad very rapidly. Individually, there is very little that we can do about our national debt, state and local government debt, or corporate debt. We can try to vote people into office that want to do the right thing, but unfortunately, fiscal responsibility and financial reform are not hot-button political issues right now. But what we can do is get our own financial houses in order. Now is not the time to take on more debt, and paying off any debt that you've already accumulated would be a very good thing. This is something that Max Slavo commentated on in one of his recent articles. The real truth that no one seems to want to hear is that those who took out these loans signed on the line and voluntarily entered into a contract. If they didn't understand the contract, it's their responsibility, a big scary word, to ask or seek clarity before the agreement is made and signed. That's called personal responsibility for your actions. However, it's lacking all over the globe, but particularly in the United States, where people are always looking to blame others for their poor decisions that they themselves have made. Blame the rich for my decision to go into debt and agree to bad terms. The debt crisis the U.S. has found itself in could very well cause another recession, such as the one that started in 2008. This is exactly why personal wealth gurus such as Dave Ramsey and Future Money Trends' James Davis tell people to avoid debt if at all possible. Doing so will protect you when others start to default on their loans. You can't default if you haven't borrowed money. It also won't matter what type of predatory loans exist if people aren't borrowing that money. Personal responsibility could help lead to more freedom. If people are not free to make bad decisions as well as good decisions, people are not free. As for the nation as a whole, we can only hope that there is as much time as possible before the inevitable implosion comes. For decades, we've been making exceedingly foolish decisions, and the consequences of those decisions are going to be exceedingly painful indeed. Because the truth is that the national debt is an existential threat to the future of this nation, and we are systematically destroying the very bright future that our children and our grandchildren were supposed to have.